Hi, everyone. I'm Barbara Beck, and I want to thank you for tuning in to Welcome Home Go. 30 minutes of discussions on challenging topics that will inspire you to go to make a difference. This shorter version, it's a spin-off of Welcome Home, was created because we know you're crazy busy, so we've made it even easier for you to find hope, to grow in your faith walk, and then go and make a difference in this challenging world of ours. You'll still get the same meaningful, inspiring discussions on topics that we believe Jesus would want us to respond to by serving wherever we're called. I want you to think about this. You've never locked eyes with anyone who was not created in the image of God. What if we saw every person as being uniquely, wonderfully created by God, deserving of our love, our care, and our attention? These next few minutes together, let's purpose to stop the busyness, to quiet our hearts, and listen for God's still, small voice. Enjoy with me now. Welcome home, go. Hey everyone, I'm so glad that you're here with us today. We have one of my favorite guests, and I say that just about everybody, Gabriel, but really and truly, you are one of our favorite people. You're a preaching partner, Dr. Gabriel Salguero, and you have a heart for people. And I have to just tell my viewers this before I talk to you. I have to tell you, viewers, that oftentimes Gabriel comes to me and he says, Barbara, we need to do a show on this. We need to do a show on that. And that's why this show exists today, because Gabriel came to me and said, Barbara, we need to do a show on the church's role in how we respond to violence in our culture. And there is so much going on in our culture today. So we do need some wisdom from one of my favorite pastors in the world. Thank you for being here with us. Are you trying to act all humble on me here?
I am trying to respond
properly
to your gracious introduction.
You really are. You're doing such
thank
a
you.
wonderful job there at Calvario City Church, and now really ministering alongside us here at Good Life 45. We feel very, very honored to have you. So how should we respond as the church?
Look, I think, first of all, the church, the first thing it should not do is ignore it. Mm-hmm. I think that people are looking for churches and pastors and congregations and to be a response, to be a haven, to provide not just a word of hope and a place of refuge, but also kind of a rationale on how we help our communities become less violent, how we help our culture become less violent. I think that violence is now a pandemic in many of our cities, but now even in our suburban towns. As you know, in recent months and years, here in Pulse, there was a violent shooting also in a church in Texas, and people going to a country music concert being shot. In addition to the daily shootings in some of our urban centers like Chicago and LA and New York. And so, if we're going to be churches in cities and in towns that is going to respond to the need of that town, then we need to also respond to this kind of pandemic of violence with a Christ-centered response.
So our response, though, how do we keep from just responding by saying, oh, our thoughts and prayers are with you. Oh, we need to just really be praying about this. And don't get me wrong, I am not underestimating the power of prayer. I think it's very important. But there are tangible things that we need to be doing also to help alleviate some of the violence that's happening, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think everything begins and ends with prayer.
Right.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, when he was responding to the violence of Nazi Germany, he says we need prayer and righteous action.
Yes.
It was that cocktail of prayer and righteous action, because when we really pray, it should inspire us to
do the right thing.
That's right,
and
a Christ-centered response to be that shining city on a hill.
Because the prayer changes us, right? And it convicts us, and that's the only reason that we have any kind of opportunity to go to the Lord in prayer is so that we can hear His voice and respond.
And it gives us courage to respond.
Yes.
Because let's be honest, we can be overwhelmed by what we see. Violence in schools, like the Parkland shooting, or Columbine, which is quite a few years back, or Virginia Tech. It's overwhelming, and so that prayer puts us in the place to say, God, we want to respond. Give us the courage. It's not lost on me that this year is the 50th commemoration
Right.
of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Back in
Right.
April
Right.
4th, and shot on a terrace in Memphis, standing up for people who were underemployed, for lack of a better term. And that same year, and we're talking about Kennedy, and so we've had quite and King received violent death threats in his house, saying they were going to shoot him and bomb his house. And his famous kitchen experience says that when he was praying and drinking over coffee, he heard the voice of the Lord that said, "Martin, stand up.
Wow.
Stand up for righteousness, stand up for what is right." And so prayer puts us in the right place. But then there's a next step in response to our prayers. What can we do? How shall we do? How shall we respond? How shall we partner with community, with law enforcement, with school officials to make sure that we stem the tide of violence in our communities?
So what are some of those things that we can be doing? I mean, obviously there's some gun control laws that need to be changed, right?
Yeah, I think that the first thing, taking a step back, because politics is always downstream from culture. I think that we really need to overwhelm the culture with a sense of civility. You know, now in the age of the spread of social media, you can be uncivil and anonymous. And I think that we, as people, we need to first lead by example in being civil to one another. People we disagree with, people from a different political persuasion, people from a different denomination, people from another faith, another culture. We need to model the way of the Prince of Peace. I often tell people, remember, folks, we serve the Prince of Peace. His name shall be called the Prince of Peace, and so we should follow that way. And so it begins with a kind of tenor and tone of civility that we don't just ask of, but we model as churches. Well, I have met with imams and I have met with rabbis to show, hey, we can have differences. We don't agree on a whole slew of things, but I have to love my neighbor as myself. So that's the first. And then partner with law enforcement around education, around, hey, what is gun violence doing to our cities and our towns? And then that next step after education is advocacy and mobilization around what are sensible gun laws that help keep our children safe, our families safe, while at the same time people feel that their Second Amendment is not being infringed on. And I think that overwhelmingly, the country, you know, we're a smart country. We have our foils and our foibles, but smart people. And they all want to do the right thing. After these mass shootings and after these daily shootings in Chicago and LA, people want to do the right thing. And I think that if we, to quote the prophet Isaiah, come, let us reason together. Let's sit around the table and find something that makes sense for you as a mom, for you as a dad, for you as a law enforcement person, for you as a person who hunts on weekends. I think that we are and the church is in a unique place, because you know what, Barbara? All of them come to church on Sunday.
That's true.
And they all hear from their pastor or from their leader. And if we can get around a message, a gospel-centered message that says, look, we can limit some gun legislation. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, doesn't mean you can drive around in a tank. Or carry a bazooka, which is an arm. There is some sensible thing that reasonable people can agree with. And I think that faith leaders and Christians should lead the way.
Do you think that a lot of faith leaders, Gabriel, are in favor of totally just revoking the Second Amendment?
I don't think so. I don't think that I think that sometimes people are portrayed that way, but I think the real message is, look, if people want to hunt, if people want to have a weekend where they go to the gallery to shoot, I think most people don't want to revoke the Second Amendment. I do think that they're opposed to weapons of mass destruction that can fire off 50 rounds, 30 rounds, and you don't need, a machine gun to hunt deer or rabbit. And I think that most people want a universal background check, so that there's checks around people who may have a history of domestic violence or a history of violence. And so there are reasonable things that people want. I myself, I don't carry a weapon. I don't see any need for it. But I have a cousin who's a state trooper. I have a brother who likes to go hunting. And so I understand that. But at the same time, I tell my brother and my cousin, I say, hey, do we really need automatic weapons?
What do they say?
They say no.
Okay.
They agree with me. But it's a reasoned discourse where I sit and I hear them. The problem is that when, on social media and Twitter, you can't have a rational argument with 140 characters.
Yeah.
You can post something, you can reflect,
Yeah.
but a dialogue.
Right.
And sometimes the way we talk to each other in this country is not really talking with and to, but at. And that's why we still have some of the most intractable problems. The tragedy is that children are the victims. The tragedy is Pulse.
Right.
The tragedy
Right.
is what happened in Texas. The tragedy is what's happened in Parkland. That if we don't take the time to make common sense legislation that says, hey, there are things, right? Imagine when people say, well, it's not guns who kill people, it's people. Yeah, but if you had a weapon that fires 14, 15 rounds, by the time law enforcement gets there,
Yeah, it's too
the
late.
damage is great. I used to live in New York, and I maybe 40 minutes away from Newtown, Connecticut. I remember. I moved here. 6 months later, Pulse happens, and more recently, Parkland. You know, there has to come a time where people say, we can do better. We should do better. And we who are Christians should be at the forefront of saying, no, Christianity is a faith of peace, of reconciliation, of nonviolence. Most of the long-lasting change in the world has been nonviolent.
So let's talk, Gabriel, just for a minute about what we allow as Christian parents in our homes, because you inferred something about social media and the power of social media. How about video games with our children? When we're allowing our children to think that it's commonplace to shoot up a bunch of people and to kill people on a video game, there's something wrong with that. There's your word reasonable again.
Yeah, and look, actually, what's ironic is my son had to write a report for middle school on gun violence and video games. And so I is
there a correlation?
Actually, no correlation has been found. Yeah,
that's shocking.
It is shocking. There are multiple results where there may be a connection, but a direct correlation has not been found. I mean,
what do you think?
Look, I think that...
Does your kid play video games?
My kid does play video games.
Violent video games?
No, there's limits in my house.
Okay.
Yeah, there's limits in my house. And I think that, you know, when I was younger, and I feel like I'm still young, Barbara.
You're definitely young.
I used to watch Bugs Bunny. You ever watch Bugs Bunny?
It's pretty violent, right?
Very violent.
Right.
Yosemite Sam used to fire off.
Exactly.
And Donald Duck was shot at by, you know, and it was.
I think that's different. I think that's different because they were doing the shooting. It's when the kids are playing the video games, they are actively involved in the killing.
And I guess the question is, when we start talking about video games is, at what age are children able to distinguish between reality and fantasy and what is not, and where are the limits, and I think that is a conversation.
Well, if it's a male, it's 25. That's when your frontal lobe gets developed.
And I think that's a conversation that regrettably we're not having enough of. About the mental health, the intellectual and emotional development of young people. Most of the times, it's young males doing the shooting, although there have been some young women who've also done the shootings, but overwhelmingly it's young male. And what are the social factors around it? They're usually isolated or bullied or abandoned or not good parenting. And so my feeling is that we need an all of the above approach to gun violence. It's not just common sense gun legislation. We certainly do need that.
That's the first step.
That's right. And I'm for it. And I've publicly stated that because, you know, if you can limit mass shootings, you've already won to some degree. But in addition to that, how do we bring support around young men in a culture of violence? How do we stem the tide where violence becomes the first response to conflict instead of de-escalation? How do we bring that into our educational system? How do we teach families to de-escalate? Parents to teach their young men and young women strategies to de-escalation. And that's a whole educational. And then the mental health issue. We have to really work. My wife, Jeanette, helped work with a group of faith leaders and the American Psychiatric Association around mental health. How the church, as a spiritual provider and a kind of mental health partner, can help people deal with this kind of overwhelming, what you say, images of violence on video games, on television, in movies. How do we help people overcome that flood of imagery that often stays in the subconscious or in the psyche.
So is anything like that being offered in the educational system?
I think that
Any kind of help, any kind of education?
Some years ago, I used to be a high school teacher. There was a program called DARE.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Drugs.
Yeah, but part of the DARE program was conflict resolution.
Aha.
And those skill sets, and then they started moving away some of those programs. Funding to education began to be cut, and usually the kind of shoulder programs are the first to go.
Yeah.
Music, art,
Right.
and one of the gifts of programs like DARE is that kids who had trouble in the classroom focusing or were in fights would be put aside, and they would be given those extra tools on conflict resolution, on nonviolent interaction, on respect and civility for yourself and for other people. I think that education around the country, as these things continue to grow and foment, needs to focus on this. How do you have that human interaction? I think churches need to have a closer understanding of nonviolence, of what it means to be nonviolent, not just in action, but in speech. You know, sometimes we are known for what we're against, but not what we're for.
Yeah.
And so it's not just that we're against violence, we are, but we're also for peace. And how do we teach our children, our young people, our parents to be peacemakers rather than warmongers?
Well, and so that has a lot, Gabriel, to do with parenting and parenting skills, and that the church can come across as being, all right, how do I teach conflict resolution? I have never in my life taken a course as a grown-up or as a child in school on how to resolve a conflict in a godly way. It's just never come across my path. I need that. Children need that. What's a knee-jerk response when a child's in trouble or when something happens to him? He hits the other cat. So they don't know how to de-escalate. I think that's a great word to use. Instead of being aggressive and going after somebody, how to give us those tools to know how to do that. We're not doing that. As a church, we're not doing that in our educational system. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things is that if we have education pastors, if we have Sunday school teachers, if we have preachers, you know, at our church, my wife and I began a training for all our leaders on conflict resolution.
Good.
From marriages but there's also conflict in the church, disagreements.
Sure.
How do you listen empathetically while holding fast to your own opinion?
Right.
It is a skill set, and there are programs across the country. Several years ago, I was invited to Washington, D.C. to speak at the Department of Justice about this issue of conflict resolution. And so half the audience was some form of law enforcement from around the country. The other half of the audience were people of color, and they were talking about tensions between people of color and law enforcement. And so we had Native Americans. It was during the time of that kind of pipeline discussion. We had African American, we had Hispanic, we had Asian, and then we had law enforcement, Black, white, Asian, sure. And one of the things that I remember a panelist, I can't take credit for, but I remember him saying it is, we have lost the word love in public discourse. It is as if we're afraid to use the word love because we think that love is a soft, mushy, emotional, weak. Love is the greatest power in the world. For God so loved that God gave. And so how do we reintroduce the word love into public discourse, into children, in a way that it's beyond sentimentality? Former Princeton professor used to say, justice is what love looks like in public. So if you love me, you want to treat me justly.
Fairly, right.
If I love you, I want to treat you justly. And so if we begin to use that very Christian virtue, that very gospel principle of love, why can't teachers talk about love? If they can talk about Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet, and they can talk about, then love is part of the kind of intellectual development and emotional development. And so if we begin to reintroduce it, and not into kind of some sensualized,
Right.
eroticized,
Right.
but love is respect
Right.
for one another and
Right.
respect for our dignity. I think our educational system, our marriages, our criminal justice system could be more restorative and redemptive if we begin to re-examine love as a public virtue.
So, Dr. Gabriel Salguero, that needs to be your next book. You need to write a curriculum for public schools that could come from that secular viewpoint, and then one for the Christian world as well. There are just two things that you have to do when you leave here today. You have to write this one and write this one, and then we'll have the curriculum. Right now, that curriculum does not exist. Would you agree?
I would agree that the curriculum does not exist. I will pray about if I'm the one to design it.
I think you have a really good grasp on it. I think it's a very strong argument that you make to put love back in, and civility. I love the word civility. How do we treat each other? How do we de-escalate our responses from aggressive, violent behavior to one of love and civility?
Look, Barbara, you are hitting it. Maybe you
No,
can
you did
co-write
it.
the book.
No. You're the one that I am being the parrot. I'm repeating back to you what you've already told me.
What is violence? If it's not a product of either deep self-loathing
Yeah.
or alienation from another person, the only way I can commit an act of violence against another human being is if I've been alienated from her or him. I don't respect the
Right.
what theologians call the imago Dei, the image of God in that person. I don't see
Right.
the beauty
Right.
and the wholeness of God in that person. Think about how an entire nation lost their capacity to love during Nazi Germany.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
No respect.
No respect for the image of God
Right.
in Jewish people during the Holocaust or in Gypsies, which were another group. And so when we begin to use love as a public virtue, using the secular language, using the gospel language, love as the ultimate characteristic of God is love in His holiness. Then we begin to have whole societies. Think about how many children were shot in Chicago last year. Talking about hundreds of children shot in Chicago. Why? We're in places where gangs are a pandemic.
Yeah.
Well, why are young men joining gangs?
They're looking for somebody to love and accept them.
No sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Often,
They want family.
That's right. Did you know that most fundamentalist, extremist institutions recruit young males? Think about people who are recruited for jihad.
Yeah.
Young males,
Right.
Gangs, because they either were abandoned or they were absentee parents or there was no structure and love. And so in that vacuum, what fills the vacuum of love? Violence, hate, domestic abuse. And so we have a love deficit.
Yeah.
And the church needs to start bringing a love surplus. And that's where we are. And we can do it. And I've seen it work in places like Boston where schools started partnering with churches and with law enforcement. So I'm not just doing theory.
Yeah.
I've seen where it works.
Yeah.
In the Bronx, there's a young pastor called Ruben Austria who's done great work with people who are formerly incarcerated, formerly violent, partnered with men who have restored their lives and have become a mentor. What are they looking for? Someone to love them and accept them and challenge them to be the best them. So violence is not the root cause. Violence is the symptom of a deeper absence of love and connection.
So if we have all these great churches in the United States, which we do, and we have the ability to communicate love and dispel anger, then why are we so much worse off than a lot of other countries as far as how many people are killed and how much more gun violence there is in other countries compared to the United States?
Regrettably, churches have a compartmentalized understanding of what it means to be church. And so we reduce church to a Sunday worship, to a midweek service, to programs,
That's true.
The church should be out in the world, should be adopting neighborhoods, should be walking what are sometimes called the night walks in the most dangerous neighborhood. That's happening here in Orlando. Several African-American and white and Latino pastors are doing night walks in the most dangerous neighborhoods just to say we're here. And so the reason is because we've often relegated ourselves to a religious silo. That what concerns the church is what happens on Sunday at 11 o'clock in the morning, rather than what's happening to people from Monday to Saturday. And that's where the real work of the church, that school teacher who is also a member of XYC Christian Church on Main Street, that school teacher, her vocation or his vocation is also to bring the principles that transform their lives into the education system.
Right.
That businessman or businesswoman, that lawyer, that judge, that probation officer who worships in my church on Sunday, I have to remind her or him, hey, you're not just a Christian from Sunday from 11 to 12:30, or if you go to some of our churches, 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah.
You are a Christian wherever you go, and that Christian virtue of love and respect and dignity should inform how you do all of life, because vocation is not separate from Christianity. It's part and parcel. And so because we have great churches that don't understand that being church is being out in the world and being God's transforming agent, society continues to decline on some issues like violence.
Well, you're helping us to see that, Dr. Gabriel Salguero, and to be able to integrate our faith, what happens on Sunday or Saturday night at church, and to integrate it into the workplace is of utmost importance, and that's part of the church's role. And I hope that you got a lot out of this this incredible discussion with Dr. Gabriel Salguero today. What do we need to do as the church to respond to the violence in our culture? You heard it today, right here from Dr. Gabriel Salguero. If you want more information about him and his church, Calvario City Church, that website is up on the screen for you right now. Again, thank you, godly man, wonderful friend, for what you're doing. You call yourself not an activist. You are an activist for Jesus.
Well, look, I'm just trying to live out the gospel and make a better world for my children and grandchildren. And thank you for lifting this up. I really appreciate it. I
love you. Thank you so much. We've got more coming up, so don't go away. Stay with us. Powerful words and discussions, even challenging in a lot of ways, right? Well, we know that you're busy, and we want to serve you in the best ways we can and make it even easier for you to find hope and be hope in this challenging world. That's why we're offering the shorter version of Welcome Home, called Welcome Home, Go. Friends, we need to be learning, applying our hearts to instruction, finding ways to be winsome to the world, but then going out and serving like Jesus would do. He would go. That's our calling. God's going to use you in ways you can't even imagine. So keep learning and growing, but take another step. You don't have to go across the ocean. Like the program you just saw, we want to share countless examples of ways you can change people's lives right here, right now. Go. Just make a difference in someone's life. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching Welcome Home, Go. I'll see you out there. God bless you.